who's been since 1982, so 30 years, he's been growing using the no-dig method, and in 4 different zones, which he might well tell us about, different types of soil from stone to silt to clay. Currently, he grows vegetables on 1/3 of an acre in Somerset, which is in the southwest of England in zone 8. And he gets 2 crops a year from beds which, as he says, are very cheap to establish and quick to maintain. He's written lots of books and has a YouTube channel with, and this is astounding, Charles, 46 million views, which is absolutely extraordinary, and writes for magazines and things. So with his 30 years of experience, he's actually going to tell us about this very different way of looking at soil and working with soil, and how the science really is beginning to stack up behind what I presume was he'll tell us again, more of a practical approach to horticulture. So Charles, take it away.
Thank you very much, Kate. Now, thank you for inviting me along. It's a great pleasure to address a wider European audience. And I just wish I could be there, that we could all be together in a room. But anyway, this is quite a good way of doing it, because a lot of what I'm teaching is very visual. And I think that's one of the reasons for success on social media. I can easily post very pretty images. There we go. Right. But one thing I never see, or hardly ever see, is my soil. So sometimes I'll dig a hole just to have a look. And in the case on the left, that was actually in my previous garden, which was clay. And at 45 centimeters down, we found a lovely array of channels, holes made by earthworms mostly. Now, that's just the bit we can see. But I was reassured, because that soil had been in bad condition when I took it over 11 years before that. And with parsnips, it used to be said, people are coming around to this now. The no-dig was, when I started 40 years ago, it was unheard of pretty much. It had been around. I mean, it's not me who's invented no-dig. I've just taken it to a more common level, I feel, made it more accessible, because it's basically common sense. And you can see how that parsnip has gone down without any problem at all. Its problem is actually getting it out. And so this is to give you an idea of what my soil is currently at Homemakers. Of all the 4 gardens I've had since 1982, this is the best soil I've had, and it's also the most level site, which means it's very easy to work as well. And you can see it's going towards clay underneath a nice silty loam topsoil. And this is how we maintain fertility every year. 1 spreading of compost, around 2.5–3 centimeters. It's a very hard thing to measure that, and I think I've misled people in the past. I've often said 5 centimeters, because that's what it looks like when you put it on sometimes, and also that could be the depth or height of the biggest lump. But the average depth, especially, I'll measure it after maybe 2 or 3 weeks. It might have rained a bit, and then it settles, and that's how much we're putting on. So just to be clear on that, and I find that it's about as much as disappears in a year. Not literally disappears, but gets eaten by soil life. And so you then end up with seeing your soil surface again, which with every year that passes gets darker. And then in the pathways, we're putting wood chip. I didn't used to do this, but I've come more and more to appreciate the fungal quality that comes with woody material. So my compost also is quite woody. We're putting more wood in the compost heaps. And we're achieving a very high level of fertility, but not excessive. And it's easily enough to grow 2 plantings a year. So that's photograph in September is entirely crops that were planted since June, and they replaced something that had already grown. For instance, even the climbing beans were after spinach, and almost none of those beds have had any compost in the last 10 months. There's 1 or 2 that might have had it in the summer if we had missed the spreading of compost the previous autumn. So the idea is it's the old-fashioned organic mantra, feeding the soil, but more precisely, that's feeding the soil life, and they do the work. It's allowing them to do the work. That's the beauty of no-dig. You don't actually need to know all that, but if you do, it's really interesting. And for a long time, I didn't know any of it really. For me, it was an instinctive thing. I just could not see the point of stirring up the soil. And then I noticed that things grew really well if I just left it alone. And then when I started out, I was mulching with hay and following Ruth Stout in the USA, more of a gardener than a market gardener. And then I found lots of slug damage. So that's when I started using compost. That was only 6 months after I began. So I've been adapting all the time. And I would say it's a pretty nice formula now going forwards in this climate. And actually with YouTube, I get feedback from all over the world. And I'm encouraged how positive it is, doing very similar to this, using compost from the Philippines, from Brazil, from Arizona, from southern India, really quite dry climates, even tropical climates. And this method seems to be very replicable with just slight variations. I'm actually been asked to give some talks in South Africa next month. That's in live. They're flying me out there. So I'm very interested to see how that goes. And
Charles, can I just, I had a comment, because we have an international audience, could you perhaps speak a little bit more slowly?
Yeah, you did say that, sorry, I forgot. Okay.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is one of the gorgeous things we see with no-dig, the mycelial network occasionally fruiting. And in my beds, this is perhaps the most common mushroom we see. I think it's a kind of lepiota. It's the naming of mushrooms is difficult because a lot of the mycological classifications have changed in the last 10 years. But the net effect in the soil is all those mycelial threads and a lot of white soil. So we have some areas here that are really quite white, and it's great for plants. And that's the result after autumn rain. So in a damp climate, or after it's been raining, we quite often see that sort of thing going on. And that suggests basically there's a decent amount of decaying wood near the surface. And it's not necessarily telling you you've got loads of mycorrhizal fungi, for example, but it's a sign. If there's some fungi there, there's probably lots of others as well. And I'm very happy to see that. Those Swedes, by the way, are an example of how we look after plants, taking off the lower leaves. And that's to keep the ground tidy and then reduce slugs. I get very few slugs with no-dig, I find, probably because we're allowing the ground beetles to thrive. We're not damaging any of the predators, and they eat the slug eggs, for example. Here's a close-up of Mycelial Breakdown, 400 times magnification. I've started working with microbiologists now, and that is so interesting. And so they'll bring their microscope along to homemakers and see what they can find. And this was just on a piece of decaying wood. So beautiful. I just love to know or imagine all of this going on out of sight mostly. So important part of this for growing, I'm very much a grower, so this is commercial production. Even on just a third of an acre, we're selling well over £20,000 worth of vegetables in a year. And that also, we produce a lot for courses that I run here and things. So it's pretty high output per acre. And for that, I'm using around 12 tons. Oh, I better talk metric here. Per hectare, it would be a lot. It would be close to 80 tons a hectare, probably, of compost. And I have a feeling some of you might be throwing your hands up in horror at this, because it might even be higher than the EU limit. And I've just remembered that this presentation is being recorded. So hello, EU Commissioner. And well, the point being though, that the laws about leaching of nutrients are framed for cow slurry and not for composting, like with that slide I showed you before. The nutrients in compost don't leach, they're stable, they're water insoluble. So making this compost is an important part of what I do. And this is a very simple way. This is great for like British allotments and smaller gardens, just using pallets, and quick, cheap to make. It's just 8 wires and 4 pieces of wood, and you've got your heap. So 2 wires on each corner. There's no cardboard at the bottom of any heap, but we put cardboard around the edge, just because this area these heaps are in actually was 6 months earlier was bindweed, brambles, couch grass, nettles, thistles, everything. But the compost heap itself is like a good mulch, and the cardboard does the rest around the edge. And then when we want to open one of those up, we can just undo 2 wires, and you've got a loose edge. The pallet swings open like a door. And we fill the outer bays only, and they go into the middle. So that's the result by October, from starting in April, for example, 6 months later. And both of the outside heaps have gone into that middle heap. And you can see there's quite a few bits of wood there. There were quite a few toads as well, some mice, everything you get in a compost heap, just loads of life basically. And that was enough probably to spread 6 or 7 of my beds, maybe 12 meters long. So we're putting it on, I think not a lot. I think we're using less compost actually per acre than traditional market gardeners would have used in the last century, when they had horse manure and all of that kind of thing in a house, to give it a historical context. In fact, I read something on YouTube, so University of Nebraska in 1870, and they were recommending 140 tons an acre of cow manure every year for growing vegetables, to give you an idea. I wouldn't do that, but that's where it was before artificial fertilizer. And so making compost, I'm using, to get enough, I'm using whatever I can get my hands on, including quite a bit of wood. And I've got a shredder, a trusty Bosch electric shredder. In fact, if we use that when the sun's out, I've got solar panels, so that helps to close the loop a bit. And it's not too noisy. That's some apple prunings there. So I'm looking always to balance the green and brown, and putting in more brown than I used to before I had this shredder. And then for the heaps, we do just 1 ton. And I find that's enough. I reckon if you do more than 1 ton, then it's what we call the law of diminishing returns. And doing this 1 ton means we get a nicer product, takes about 2 hours. And then you'll get that 2 hours back when you come spread the compost, because it's nicer and quicker to use. And it's often between 6 and 8 months old, up to a year. For me, the best value of compost is in that time window, 8 to 12 months, probably not more than 18. You start to lose volume in particular. And then we're looking at 1 or 2 other ways of making compost as well. So for example, some of you might have heard of this one, a professor in Texas, Johnson, and his wife Sue, and they've been experimenting with aerobic wood chip. So using drain pipes like that, which you then take out after you've filled the heap, and the outer container is weld mesh. You can reuse all of that time and again. And it's on top of a pallet where you've got airflow coming in the bottom. So the idea is it's aerobic decomposition of wood. So we're comparing this with heaps that are open to the elements, and I have to say that so far I'm not seeing much difference for all that extra work. But I'd put this up just as a thought-provoking idea, and to show that we're always trying new things here, and sometimes they don't work. If they do, though, it's great. And one of the things I'm doing always is a trial of my dig and no dig comparison beds. So every year in December, I dig the bed that's on the left in each photograph. So each photograph has 2 beds side by side. The left-hand one is the dig bed, the right-hand one is no dig. They both have the same amount of compost. They're both planted on the same day at the same time. They're both harvested at the same time. All harvests are recorded for kitchen-ready trimmed vegetables. That's what we record as the weight of harvest. And there's 2 plantings a year on this bed. And for example, there you can see the May plantings on the left and the summer plantings on the right. Sorry, when I said May plantings, I should have said March, because the photograph is in May. So we have the spring vegetables, then we have the summer and autumn vegetables. And there's very little ground preparation between doing that. Just rake it level if needed even. And most of the weeding is on the dig bed. And the harvest over 9 years now since I arrived at Homemakers are there. You can access this image on my website. There's a page all about trials with a lot of this data on, free to anyone who wants to have a look. And you can see a reasonably consistent pattern there of the no dig bed being higher harvest for less time needed, basically. Many people ask what the devil went on in 2017 and 18. It's just the weather. We had a lovely year and then we had a dry year. This is fascinating, where you can see difference in soil structure. So the dig bed on the left, no dig on the right. And the way I would explain this on the right is where you've got the humic glues from glomalin, which is the sticky substance you get on the outside of mycorrhizal fungi. And as those mycelia thread their way through the soil, they leave behind them a sheath or a skin which is sticky, and that's called glomalin. Was only discovered in 1996 by Sarah Wright in the States, and it's now reckoned that's a really important part of soil. I mean, 25 years ago, it wasn't even known. You know, this is how my take of science is that it's a contemporary snapshot, and that's all. You know, it's evolving all the time. You never reach the end with science, and so you've got to always bear that in mind. You know, there's always lots of working hypotheses, really, but glomalin does seem to have an important role in aggregation of soil particles, which gives you stable structure, and that's the lovely crumbly soil you get with no dig. And there is another comparison between dig on the left and no dig on the right by a different guy with a different microscope at a different time, and very similar result. And also he pointed out, if you look in the middle of the photograph on the right, you can see what's called a diatom, and that's the origin of diatomaceous earth, the lovely silica-rich earthy substance which has fantastic properties against pests. And diatoms don't occur much in soil, but when you see them, that's a good sign. And they oxygenate. They're taking carbon dioxide and turning it into oxygen. There's also an amoeba there. There's so much going on in soil, fascinating. And then this is a scientist I'm working with, still waiting for the results, but she's got a whole year of results. And one very simple thing she did was putting calico or cotton strips in both of those beds and seeing how quickly they degraded as a sign of microbial life. Anyone could do that. And it was quite a bit more degradation in the no-dig, as you might imagine, but it was just good to see. And then here's another trial we're doing, which I call the 3-strip trial. So you won't have time to absorb all this information here, but again, it's on my website. So you just click on that page. And what I was really trying to find out here was more than anything, the difference between strip 1 and strip 2, because strip 1 is forked and strip 2 is no dig. They both have the same compost. Strip 3 is also no dig and has different compost. And the main difference we see over 6-7 years of doing this now, 8 years even, is that strip 1, that beds that are forked, give slightly lower harvest in the end. And intriguingly, they often look the same, but when you come to harvest, the weight is not there. You know, that would be a fascinating study for anyone to do, I reckon. And also within this trial, I'm doing a no rotation trial. So the bed of broad beans you can see in the slide on the left and the potatoes, they are consecutive every year, broad beans, potatoes, and every year the broad beans are followed by cabbage, and every year the potatoes are followed by leeks. That's what you can see in the right-hand photograph. So it's 2 plantings a year, but every year it's the same 2 plantings in the same beds there. And again, the harvests have been fantastic. No obvious sign of going down. And you've got all these tables over those 8 years. I'm not going to dwell a long time. I haven't got time, I'm afraid. But, you know, if you really want to study this, there's a lot to learn there. And then another thing we found we can measure is bricks. So that's very easy with a handheld refractometer. They cost about £30, I think. And so I came across this video on YouTube, and this PhD guy was saying in no uncertain terms, you've got to have 12% bricks to prevent insect damage. So I thought, well, I don't think I've got 12. 12% is a lot. You know, that would be really sweet. If you look at the figures, we got like red onions 12, and apple, well, that was 15. A large beetroot was 11, interesting. But very few of the leaves were 12. So I don't know where he got that figure from. It's too general. This is where I'm generally pretty wary of numbers. You've got to be careful how you interpret them, above all, even things like pH, and how pH varies around the root of the plant. You know, it's not like a global figure that applies to all of your soil. So don't get too hung up on figures. That would be certainly advice I'd give to, especially a lot of beginners who I find get quite daunted by it. And then this is looking ahead now. You know, what else can we find out? We're doing a lot of things that I still don't really know what they're doing, but I'm doing them anyway to see what results might be. And that on the left, that's a tower along the lines suggested by Philip O'Callaghan, energy tower, rather like the Irish round towers. I don't know if any of you know those. And it's alternating layers of organic and inorganic material inside clay, sets up a low frequency energy transmitter. You know, a little bit along the lines of maybe Avebury and Stonehenge, those monuments. Maybe that's transmitting some good energy to my garden, or maybe it's not. I don't know, and nor does any scientist, because we can't measure those energies yet. That's where we are. That's the limit that we have to acknowledge with science, and that's why I don't tolerate any scientist who tells me this is superstition. It's only because they can't measure it. You know, that's the word they use when they can't measure things. I'm certainly not anti-science, but I'm just anti that very narrow interpretation of it. There's a lot more to find out, and biochar is another one. And I met this guy recently, Connor Lassalle, who's invented that kiln for making charcoal, and it gives an exceptionally clean burn. It's not at all like the traditional old heaps of mouldering charcoal. So you've got air coming up between two cylinders of steel, and the burn is all at the top. It looks like the gas flame you have on a cooker. It's coming out really clean horizontally, and that burns off all the methane. So you've got very limited emissions. It's not smoking. And then what you have to do is, when the burn goes down and down, and once it gets to the bottom, you've got to put it out before it burns the charcoal that's formed and would turn that into ash. So then we pour water on it, and then we've got our charcoal. And there's an example of doing something for the future. I haven't done that much yet, but we're going to use this in the compost heaps. So charge the charcoal and turn it into true biochar. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I now hand over to Hilary.
Thank you very much, Charles. You really did gallop through that in 20 minutes. Thank you. But we'll have time for questions afterwards. And right. Hilary, if you could share your screen. Now, Hilary is one of a number of gardeners I've now discovered in heritage gardens who have been following the no-dig method for quite some years. And she's at Hampton Court in the UK, which is one of our most historic gardens. So I think you had the screen just there, didn't you?
Yeah, hang on, just give me a moment.
She's described as the kitchen garden keeper and the vine keeper at Hampton Court Palace. And so she looks after the historic walled garden using both old and modern gardening techniques to grow a wide variety of vegetables, fruits and herbs all the year round. As I said earlier when we were talking, Charles and I, it's been quite a journey for me, having been working in a heritage context, to then think that we could stop digging and still have an authentic garden. So some of those issues I'm sure Hilary will be sharing with us. So fire away, Hilary.
Good afternoon. So today I'm going to be talking about no-dig gardening in a heritage context, specifically looking at the place that I work, which is here in the kitchen garden at Hampton Court Palace. So the subject that I'll be briefly covering in this talk is firstly just to give you a quick introduction to Hampton Court Palace and the Royal Kitchen Garden, and then I'll talk about what we do, so the soil cultivation techniques that we use here, and then the authenticity of them, so how they compare to what would have been done historically. And then how well does this work in practice, and how our visitors engage with it as well. So this is Hampton Court Palace. It's located in the furthest southwest part of London, and is especially famous for its Tudor history, especially the notorious English King Henry VIII. But its rich history also includes the Georgian and Victorian periods. The palace is owned by the Crown, but also run by Historic Royal Palaces, which is a charity that also manages the Tower of London, Kensington Palace, Kew Palace, and Hillsborough Castle in Northern Ireland. And here's a map of the palace grounds, just to put it into context, the size of the grounds that we're managing here. So the palace sits within a wider estate of Home Park and Bushy Park, and large areas like this are an important feature of the wider London area. The palace is well known for these extensive gardens, and they include the South Front Parterre Garden, which is right next to the river here, and also the East Front Gardens with their great big lawns and these distinctive mushroom-shaped yew trees. So on the opposite side of the gardens to what we've just seen is an area that's known as the Till Yard. This is an area that would have been previously used for jousting in the Tudor times, and today you can still see the towers that were used for viewing sport. From the time of King William and Queen Mary, this area was converted into a kitchen garden to feed the royal household, and this is a plan of it from 1736. And it clearly shows the intensity of the productive gardening at that time and the use of these brick walls to create a warm, sheltered garden that included a lot of fruit. The specimens grown at Hampton Court were used by the writer and artist George Brookshaw in his book Pomona Britannica and used as examples of the highest quality fruit being grown. There was, however, a decline of the gardens by the 1800s, however, when Hampton Court fell out of favour as a royal residence and the vegetable production moved to Windsor instead. The area was leased to some private market gardeners for some time after that. And the use of the area changed again in the 20th century. This part of the gardens was converted to tennis courts, a rose garden, a car park, and a herbaceous area and lawn, reflecting the changes in priorities and what was considered to be important at the time. So where the kitchen garden is today is the area highlighted in green here, and you can see that it's 1/6 of that original size. And the photo on the left shows what the area looked like. So it was a nice park area, but nothing particularly exciting. Then a decision was made to rebuild part of the kitchen gardens in 2014. They used information from the National Archives at Kew, and archaeological surveys were carried out on the site, which showed the evidence of the path layout that you can see here. So this was a major project involving, first of all, a lot of research and planning, and then the site works. So removing trees, building paths, adding drainage, water and power supplies, refurbishing the pond in the corner of the garden, renovating the pavilions that hold the historic garden displays, cultivating the existing topsoil, adding more soil and organic matter, and finally planting with 82 fruit trees, 60 espalier fruit, 180 soft fruit bushes, and 2,500 square metres of vegetables. And there was apparently quite heavy rain during this period, which made the work difficult. The dimensions of the garden are as specified and in historical sources that we have from the 18th century. And it does look very much like what would design today for a no-dig veg garden, with these long strips of cultivated soil, as you often see in modern organic market gardens. And the garden's laid out with 254 small beds of 1.5 by 5 metres, which is a similar layout to the original Georgian kitchen garden, as we saw in that drawing. But this also lends itself very well to no-dig. And there's a rotation system of different groups of crops in the veg beds, such as alliums, brassicas, legumes, and so on, surrounded by a border of red currants, black currants, gooseberries, and dwarf apple trees, just here. And then around the far edge, we've got cut flower borders and wall-train fruit trees. It's a warm, sunny garden in the warmest part of the country, and so we're able to grow nice things like peaches and nectarines on the south-facing walls, with cooking apples and morello cherries on the opposite side. The fruit and veg that we grow is mostly sold to visitors, but we've recently started supplying some to the cafe in the gardens as well. We've put displays of seasonal herbs in the Tudor kitchens within the palace. So the garden isn't certified organic, but we try and keep to organic principles as much as possible. I think that organic certification is great from a consumer point of view, as it gives people some idea of the farming standards involved in food production. But here the garden is open to visitors, so it's very easy for them to see where the produce is coming from. They can walk around, they can look at it, and they can talk to the gardeners. So although it's nice to look back at the garden as it is in the summer, this is what it looks like at this time of year as we're partway through our winter mulching. The garden is maintained using mostly a no-dig method. So we won't routinely dig over the soil, but instead we add layers of mulch. And this is what we're doing at the moment, is we're adding a thick layer of compost onto the veg beds. We'll also take this opportunity to hoe and then pack down the gravel paths and to top up the chip bark that forms paths between the individual beds. This helps to suppress the weeds, and having the paths there means that we can avoid standing on the veg beds as much as possible, since we can reach across to the centre of the beds from both sides. Previously, we have used compost that's been made in the wider palace grounds, at a site within the park, and materials collected from across the gardens, so from the gardening work that's happening on the east front or the south front, for example, and allowed to break down in huge piles in the works yard. Then as a contractor comes around with a huge shredding machine on the back of a truck, and the compost is loaded into this with a JCB, and then it chops it all up into small pieces, and then it's allowed to rot down for another year or so. Because of the mass of the material there, it reaches a really high temperature, but there have been still some uncertainties about contamination with perennial weeds. So this year a decision was made to buy more compost in bulk bags, which are then dropped off at the kitchen garden. We'll then shovel it and barrow it out and spread it on the beds, but we may or may not go back to using the more local product in the future. We do make our own compost within the kitchen garden as well. It's an important part of organic vegetable gardening, and it's good to demonstrate how it works. Our compost heap has 3 large bays, with the new material constantly be adding to this first bay, and then each part of it gets turned by hand into the next bay about once every 6 weeks. When the compost is ready to be used, we'll sieve it using this homemade device here. So one person scoops up the compost onto the metal grid here, and then we shake it and rake it around so that the larger sticks and rocks are removed. And then we use it as a mulch directly on top of the soil. Another technique that we sometimes use is hotbeds. And this is a very old technique, as forcing crops to make them productive out of season is always been something that gardeners have tried to do, especially in the context of royal or wealthy people's gardens. There's a great example of this at the Lost Gardens of Heligan in Cornwall in England, where they have been used to great effect to grow pineapples even. These beds work by making a thick pile of fresh manure and then covering it with the growing medium. As the manure ferments, it gives off heat, raising the temperature of the hotbeds, and this allows us to extend the growing season, growing salad in winter, starting earlier in the spring, and then using the residual heat to grow melons in the summer. Here's some coriander that's been grown in the spring in one of these beds. And the photo on the right is the spinach as it looks now. So at the beginning of February, it's growing slowly but surely under the protection of the glass lights. Here's a photo of the hotbeds being created on the left. So you might be able to see the metal pole just there, which we inserted into the fresh manure, which is to test the heat. When these beds are up and working properly, you'll find that when the pole is removed, it's too hot to touch even. However, just to talk about the practicalities of this process for a minute, it involves a lot of effort to dig out the previous year's soil and then fill these beds again. We also have to source fresh horse manure, and it's a messy and smelly process to bring it in on a tractor and to be barrowing it back and forth in a garden that is open to visitors. And although I have had some success with this type of hotbeds in the past, these ones unfortunately didn't quite get up to temperature. I think that the issue here might be perhaps the height of the beds, as they're not raised up enough to give enough volume, enough mass to build up that heat that we require. However, with all that manure, once rotted down, it did mean that the soil was rich enough to grow this exceptionally big marrow, which became quite a popular feature in the garden. So these historical techniques can be extremely effective, and it would be great if we could experiment with them more, but we do still have a lot to learn. One more modern technique that we've just started using is the use of strolch, which is a mineralized straw product that's spread on the surface of the soil as a mulch, which helps to suppress the weeds. Now, to look at the authenticity of our soil cultivation techniques, one of the most interesting aspects of a garden like this is being able to look at what we're doing now and to compare it to historical sources. And one of the most important sources that we have is this book, The Retired Gardener, which is a translation of an earlier French gardening text, adapted for English gardens by the royal gardeners George London and Henry Wise in 1706. And this gives us a great insight into the methods that would have been used in Hampton Court at that time. And a lot of these gardening books are available to read online, and I highly recommend giving them a look if you get the chance. I've just chosen to show these pages at random just because I like the pictures, especially the diagram of a tool for getting rid of caterpillars. Yeah. The gardeners at the time did certainly understand the importance of ground cultivation techniques. So the very first subject discussed in The Retired Gardener is the qualities of a good soil. And although they do make the point that it seems counterintuitive to invert the soil layers when this isn't what happens in nature, as they describe it, there are layers of good and bad soil. So what it says up here, like the top earth is always allowed to be better than that which lies underneath it, either by being dung by cattle, sweetened by the air, made productive by tillage, etc. The best part of the earth must nevertheless, according to his directions, be laid 3 feet within the ground. Now, what can be more absurd? Having said that, though, the emphasis at that time was very much on digging, and they took digging the soil very seriously indeed. The whole second chapter in the book is, in fact, dedicated to the subject. And so at great length, they describe how you have to dig trench after trench in the earth through the full depth of the soil profile, and even describing how to dig a trench 6 feet deep for planting a fruit tree against a wall, with instructions on how to make sure that the wall itself didn't fall down. They saw, quite rightly though, a great importance in the depth of the soil, and they thought that it was important for the air, the moisture, and the sun's warmth to penetrate through it. So just reading through these pages, it seems like the no-dig technique that we use today is not historically very authentic at all. However, there are some similarities. They go on to say that the organic material should be kept close to the surface of the soil and not dug right into the bottom of the trench. And interestingly, actually, I think we had a question about this just after the first section of talks that we had this morning, but they do say in 1701 about the use of leaf mould as a mulch to protect the new seedlings from heavy rainfall and from late frosts. And as they say, it happened in the months of March and April 1701. So it's nice to be able to get these details about what happened from these texts as well. And they also describe the addition of manure as a coin with which to repay the earth, which I think is a lovely way of thinking about it. So when we're working in a garden such as Hampton Court, we have to always be asking ourselves questions about the historical accuracy of what we're doing versus the modern day practicalities. It's a functioning garden and not a living history display, so we need to find a balance between the two. For example, we use a lot of netting in the garden, which is vital to protect our plants from birds and insect pests. We have a lot of trouble with allium leaf miner and leaf moths, which are becoming more widespread in the UK with a changing climate. And so it's something that we have to deal with now that probably wasn't an issue back in the 1700s. And we need to produce good quality fruit and veg. Our customers are used to getting food from the supermarket, and they won't appreciate finding a caterpillar in their broccoli. In some cases, it makes more sense to use the technology that's available to us, as the Georgian gardeners would have done, being great innovators themselves. When we're deciding what to grow, we do consider a lot of old-fashioned cultivars though. Some of these varieties, such as the heritage tomatoes, have a fantastic flavour, not having been bred for easy transport and long shelf life, like some of our more modern ones. It's important to grow them in order to preserve their genetics for future generations. However, we do grow some modern varieties that have been bred for improved vigour or pest and disease resistance. Since the garden's open to visitors, we want to make sure that it looks good. So again, it's just about finding that balance. So moving on to talk about how well the no-dig works in practice. First of all, visually, it looks great. We've got these neatly mulched beds and it looks really neat. The disadvantages are that when it rains, the compost does tend to wash off the bed slightly, which doesn't look quite so great. And we also have some birds here that like to flick the mulch everywhere as they look for food. Although digging would be messy, we do spend a lot of time trying to keep the paths clear of soil and weeds, since the beds don't have any edges of them. And the sourcing of compost has posed a couple of challenges as well. As I mentioned before, we need to make sure that the compost isn't introducing any new weeds into the garden. And we have to think about whether it's better to buy in compost or perhaps from an environmental perspective, if it's better to use what the gardens here produce. In their book that I talked about earlier, London and Wise specifically refer to the soil in this area as a sandy, loamy soil of greyish colour, has answered all that we could expect of a good earth, which is a very positive description. And probably if we were digging the soil as they were, it would become more manageable. However, we're still close to the River Thames here, and the soil is quite silty and full of stones. So growing in layers on top of it does seem much easier. It's much softer to plant into, and the weeds can be hoed off with very little effort compared with areas where the mulch hasn't been added. So with improved soil health, we get better soil diversity as well. As gardeners looking after a piece of land, we have a responsibility for the animals, the plants, and the fungi that live here. So the biodiversity is important too. The layout of the garden presents us with some challenges as well. So with many beds and different types of vegetables growing, it is a lot of work. This is a really intense form of gardening. Each one of these 254 beds might have 2 or 3 different crops or successional plantings each year. So logistically, that takes a bit of organisation. And although the mulching process does certainly help with the suppression of weeds, we do have some issues with perennial weeds, in particular bindweed. Part of the reason for this is that the pandemic unfortunately hit the Historic Royal Palaces organisation very hard in the past years. And during much of 2020, the garden was completely closed off due to restrictions on the palace opening to the public and the gardens team not being able to come into work. This meant that the garden did become very overgrown for this period. This photo was taken in July 2020, and although it looks quite colourful at this stage, the garden really wasn't being maintained, and a lot of those weeds were allowed to go to seed. So we've got an additional load of weed seeds and perennial weed roots in the soil to have to manage now. We now have a reduced number of staff to look after the gardens. There's only 2 of us in the kitchen garden, plus a great team of volunteers. But we do have other demands on our time, such as caring for the grapevine, which also lives at Hampton Court. However, the team has worked extremely hard, and I'm very proud of them as they've got the garden back into a good state again. Included in the design of this garden are areas of green manure, which are grown in different parts of the garden as part of the crop rotation. This has got many advantages because it adds nutrition to the soil, it improves its structure, it helps to hold the soil together, and it's a useful organic growing technique to demonstrate. And it's also historically quite accurate, as the old gardening books describe growing legumes to enrich the soil before planting other crops. Periodically, we cut it down by hand using a scythe, which you might just about be able to see on the wall behind me. And although you might not usually allow green manure to flower, we actually did that last year with our mixture of buckwheat, phacelia, clover and alfalfa, and it looked absolutely amazing and was filled with lots of bees and other insects. However, green manure isn't generally included in a no-dig garden, and it leaves us with the question as to how to get rid of it when we want to plant something else in that area. In 1700s, they would have added a load of manure and then gone about their process of digging trenches and mixing the soil up. But if we wanted to keep with the no-dig method, we'd have to spray it, which isn't what we want to do in an organic principle garden. Or we would have to cover it to exclude light, and having black plastic and bricks on the ground is fine at the allotment, but it doesn't look great in a historic palace garden. We've tried digging it over and leaving it on the surface of the soil, but that takes time to break down, and we really want to be planting into the soil as soon as possible in the spring. So what we're trying at the moment is just digging out the remaining clover and then adding it to the compost heap, and then adding a compost mulch on the surface of the beds. So it's a minimal dig rather than a no-dig system, but I'm definitely open to suggestions if anybody has any other ideas. One of the other slight disadvantages to adding all this mulch in the winter is that sometimes we still have crops growing in the beds. For example, we'll have spring cabbages, which are planted in August, and winter salads and pak choi growing over winter. Garlic, which is also grown through the coldest months, is easy enough to mulch around, but we have to mulch the other beds here at slightly different times of the year. And finally, I'll talk about how the visitors engage with all of this. most importantly, we have to look at the bigger picture, I think. The majority of visitors are here for a day out and to visit the palace and its wider gardens. Families make up a large number of visitors, and for children we have this area called the Magic Garden in this photo here. It's just basically a big play area with this great big dragon in it, so frequently that becomes the focus of their visit. A lot of people also come for the Garden Festival, which is held on this site every year, as well as lots of other events. So the focus isn't necessarily on the kitchen garden itself, although many people do walk around and enjoy it. We do have plenty of interest though. Lots of visitors ask questions, and frequently we do get asked about no-dig. There's been a lot more interest recently, with many more people starting to grow their own vegetables for the first time, and new allotment holders who want to learn about it. It's a really broad subject, so we've started running occasional courses in the kitchen garden. These have included an introduction to grow your own, kitchen garden skills day with the Working for Gardeners Association, design students from Kingston Landscape College coming and spending a week in the garden, and hopefully we'll do more of that in the future. One of the most significant ways that we interact with the public is by selling the produce from the garden. It's really popular and it allows visitors to take home some fresh produce. We did previously do a market sale in the garden once a week, but it got incredibly busy in the summer, and rather than trying to get all the harvesting done in one morning, we found it's easier to just put something out on the stall most days with an honesty box in place. We also take volunteers to help out in the kitchen garden, which is becoming a large part of the garden's workforce. They do a valuable job helping us with weeding, harvesting, and general maintenance of the garden. There are regular volunteers that come in every week, forming an important community connection. And Hampton Court is a much loved garden, so there is a demand for positions whenever they become available. We hope that by engaging with visitors, having volunteers and running courses, we'll get more people interested in veg gardening, or even just to think about how food is grown or the history that there is here, or just to take an interest in the environment around them. And finally, we hope to make more connections with other gardens and share knowledge between us. And I hope that's something that we've done today at this webinar. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Hilary, and really inspiring to see you trying to get the garden back after a couple of years that we've all had to be concentrating on other things. It looks like you've made a really good job of that. So we've got lots of questions to fire at both of you, but just while you have a bit of a breather, I'm hoping that Ernestine, we could have the little poll, a questionnaire of our participants, just to see how many of them are actually digging the ground or not digging the ground, because it might add something to our discussions. So,
how much time do they need, do you think, Kate?
How many questions are we asking?
It's 3 main questions with add further information, so it's not that many. Yeah.
No, so just a couple of minutes, I would think. Yeah, so we'll have a little pause while people answer these questions. Here we go. So, well, I've managed to do mine, so I don't know how everyone else is doing. Charles, did you get it on your screen as well?
Oh, no.
Perhaps you didn't. Perhaps it would have been an insult to you, actually, to ask these questions and fairly obvious answers.
I was actually just answering some of the
oh, some of the questions that have come in. Ah,
yeah.
Right. So, we'll probably do those verbally as well, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah, okay.
That will take up a few minutes, I think. So, Ernestine, is the poll still going? It is.
Yes, it's almost 2 minutes now.
Okay. So let's just wait a little while, because it's quite interesting to see the answers coming straight away, just to give us an idea of our audience of 118 people, which is quite a nice scientific sample, isn't it? When I was asking this question, as I said earlier, of National Trust colleagues, there were some that have been doing it for many years, Clumber Park being one, and then others that are just trying it recently. And the main problem that they all have is obtaining enough compost. As you were saying, Hilary, it's where do you get it from? And it looked like you use composted green waste, do you, when you do buy it in?
Yeah, that's right. So we had a green waste that we bought in, but also a green waste which was produced on site. So we've got a larger scale compost production actually within the park at Hampton Court. So that's material which has been taken from all of the gardening that happens in all the different parts of the gardens at Hampton Court and made on a larger scale. So it's like we actually make our own green waste compost.
Right. Okay. So Ernestine, are you ready?
Should I end it now? 3 minutes. Yeah. So
okay.
then it's ended.
So it was just 3 very simple questions about dig and no dig. Feels like the great reveal, doesn't it? You can see what nerds we are. We're so fascinated by who digs and who doesn't. Jo is in the chat is saying she's a volunteer at Clumber Park Wall Garden. And that the no dig beds needed less watering, less weeding, and had better yields than the traditional beds. That's fascinating.
I'll just try to share it now, Kate.
Okay.
And test if you can see the hole when I'm scrolling down.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, that was the problem earlier, wasn't it?
Here we go. Yeah. I'm not sure if I have the right way to do it, but I'll
okay.
try.
Okay. Give it a try. Here we are.
How is it now?
Yes, we can see.
Oh, you can?
Yeah.
Good.
Okay, we can see the whole lot. So you could, start off, do use the no dig system. And so that is 35% do and 62% don't, with a couple of don't knows. And yes, some of the answers, yes, some of the planting beds they do. We routinely mulch shrub and herbaceous beds, but want to find out more about no dig to see if we can use this method elsewhere. And it's used in parts of the garden. So it's sort of some and some. And then, yes, the majority, 65% do still dig. And 35, well, that's obvious. If you either do or you don't you? And they're trying to reduce it. Interesting, yes. So this is an interesting one, mechanical cultivation, which we haven't really even talked about, using rotavators or plows or whatever. And the vast majority don't, 55%. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we're in public gardens and therefore it's not something that the public wants to see. But 33% do, interestingly. And hand tools only, half and half, and it's too small an area is the background. Okay, well, thanks very much, Ernestine, for sharing that. It might influence some of the panel discussion. So we now have lots of questions to go through to start with, it's for Charles, I think, because he spoke first. So lots of congratulations. Thank you for the interesting talk. and agreeing that it's a really good way of increasing soil fertility, but also somebody saying, how could they convey some of your happiness in seeing fungi to my customers who come worrying and how to get rid of it? So that's something, Charles, I think we're quite used to visitors asking that question.
It's education. It's a chance to educate, actually, because fungi have had, until recently at least, a bad name. And we associate fungi with diseases like potato blight and that kind of thing. And most fungi, though, are good. And, well, we like to eat mushrooms for sure, but I'll always take that as an opportunity to emphasize the value of fungi and all the good work they're doing in the soil. So I hope that you could convey that to your boss or whoever it might be.
Good. So this is one for Hilary. Have you noticed that you're disturbing wildlife, like insects, in the compost heaps when they're shredded? And how long do you let the material lie before you shred it? So this is obviously a concern about biodiversity, I think, within the garden.
Yeah, so I wouldn't be able to give you the details of when we do the larger scale composting, because that's not, like, I only work within the kitchen garden, and that's a process that happens on the wider estate. It does get turned fairly regularly with like a mechanical digger. So I'd say that there probably isn't an awful lot in there. Within the kitchen garden itself, there's not an awful lot of insect life. We do get sort of flies and things in the summer occasionally. Unfortunately, the only wildlife that we find in the compost heaps in the kitchen garden is we do get occasionally rodents decide to make a home in there. But we try and stop that from happening by turning it fairly regularly. So within the kitchen garden, we'll turn it every 6 weeks, just to try and stop that from happening. But I understand your concerns as to not to want to harm any wildlife, but I can't really give you an answer about the process of actually making the green waste, I'm afraid.
And this one is sort of related, and I think Charles might come in on this as well, is how can you stop slugs in the kitchen garden?
I think that's got to be like the #1 question that we get asked by visitors, is about slugs. I think a lot of it is to do with the design of the garden. So most people in their gardens at home will have lots of shrubs and bushes and hedges, and that's lots of places for the slugs to hide and live in. And then because of that, the slugs just crawl out of there every night and they eat all your precious plants. But what we've got here is we've got a very open, quite a large garden. There's lots of gravel paths, there's lots of wide open spaces. So there's not so many places for the slugs and snails to hide. And they don't like to travel so far. They don't like to cross all these gravel paths in the open in order to get to the vegetables. So we don't have too much of a problem with them. I think also the scale of the garden is important. Like, we are fortunate to have a great big kitchen garden of about 1 acre. So if we lose 1 or 2 of our cabbages, it's not a big deal. Whereas if you're working in a smaller garden and you lose 1 or 2 of your cabbages and you're only growing 5, it's much more of a disaster. So I think that those are the 2 things. If you are in a smaller garden, one thing that I would recommend that is very effective is making a trap out of beer. So put a little bit of sweet beer into a jam jar and just sink it at an angle into the ground. And that's quite an effective way of trapping slugs in just your normal back garden. But here I think we don't have a problem just because of the layout of the garden itself.
Right. Charles, you actually mentioned that you felt that no dig helped with slugs.
Yeah, definitely, because of how it doesn't damage any of the soil ecology. For example, you're not killing any ground beetles which eat slug eggs and slugs. I don't know how many of you have seen a ground beetle eating a slug. I certainly haven't. Someone did. I mentioned this on Twitter once, and someone very helpfully put up a video of a very painstaking process of a beetle eating a slug. And then, of course, you've got frogs and toads. We see a lot of toads in the garden here, and I'm sure that they're doing quite a bit of that kind of thing. So there's a whole ecology in the soil, maintaining a balance, and that inevitably, any kind of cultivation will damage it. And I would say anyone who's doing any kind of tilling of the soil really needs to consider that. And, you know, when I started organic growing in the 80s, it was, people were always talking about wildlife, but they never talked about the wildlife of the soil. That's a huge part of wildlife that until recently has been massively neglected. And that goes right down to the microscopic level, which we're only just starting to find out more about. And a lot of that's thanks to Elaine Ingham, initially Soil Food Web in the US. But yeah, so keeping the ecology, and the one other thing, I certainly agree with Hilary, scale does help, but keep your garden tidy. That's a big difference, because slugs are attracted to decaying leaves and vegetation. That's their job. They're recyclers. So give them less to recycle. Like we don't have wooden sides, you probably saw, if anyone's got wooden sides, you know, they're going to harvest slugs. So it's all that kind of thing. Reduce habitat.
Okay, thank you. And there was one actually right at the beginning, and it's a lovely example of the linguistic differences. Something about, do you apply gear use? So this is Anna. And I was thinking, now what does that mean? But of course, it's very logical. It's rotation. So things that go round, as in gears. So,
I like that.
so do you use rotation in your garden with no dig?
Yeah. Well, I don't actually. I mean, not in terms of any kind of systematic rotation. I'll usually look to follow a planting of one family with a planting of another family. That could often be in the same year. So I might follow, say, lettuce with carrots or vice versa. But for the following year, I'm not considering what was there the year before. I'll start with a clean slate, and I'm mixing things up a lot more, I think, than people do when they rotate. And it gives me the chance to be much more free and to vary my cropping year on year. I haven't got to stick to the program blocks. And the trial I mentioned has been fascinating. I never expected that result. And this year we're coming now into it's the 9th year. I think it is. No, 8th year. 8th year of planting potatoes in the same place. And each year I do that, I struggle. Personally, I've come from a farming family. I've brought up to rotate. But I reckon with no dig, and it's something I just want to find out more about, that's why I'm running the trial. I reckon with no dig, you've got a healthier soil, you've got much less need to rotate. I'm not saying rotation is a bad idea, just that probably we need to do it less than we maybe thought.
Great. Okay, that does sort of free you up. I'm absolutely bound by the 4-year rotation and the
well, you don't need to be.
No, exactly. Okay, so here's Joachim, and he is asking, Hilary, are there rules and regulations that force you to take historical practice into consideration in Hampton Court, or is it up to you?
It's mostly up to us to decide what we do day to day. There's the process of what we do. It's not entirely down to myself and the gardens team. We're not fully free to do what we like. It's within certain parameters, and it's basically a process of just discussing with the managers and having regular meetings and communication with the other people involved in the palace. There's the whole wide gardens team here, but for the most, there aren't any specific regulations that I'm aware of that would really affect the day-to-day management of the garden. I think the only time that would come into play would be if we wanted to do something major. If we wanted to make a big change in the garden, then I think that's something that we would have to look at. But in the day-to-day running of the garden, no, not really. And
related to that, a question from Jan. Was it controversial? You weren't there, I don't suppose, when the decision was made to go no dig, but was it controversial? Was there much mention in the gardening press or anything like that?
I wasn't there in 2014 when the garden was first created, but as far as I'm aware, it was no dig right from the start. Yeah, and so I think that it was just a very positive reaction when the garden was first created, because as I said, it wasn't going from anything particularly exciting. It was just a sort of herbaceous area of the garden, and it's always been designed with this no dig structure in mind.
Can I add something here, please?
Yeah, of course.
There's quite a big movement to no dig in the UK amongst larger institutions, and as you know, Kate, with the National Trust and the RHS, is really positive at Wisley. I don't know if you've been there, but the World Food Garden. And that came about through a woman called Sheila Das, who's manager of the edible gardens there. And that came about through her attending a lecture I gave at Kew Gardens in 2011 about no dig, and she thought, well, that's a good idea, I'll go and try it on my allotment. She saw how it worked, and she's brought no dig through becoming manager of edible gardens into Wisley. And she said how this spring they were making this garden, it's nearly an acre, nearly 4,000 square meters of edible garden, and they were applying the mulch on top of the beds, and she got a lot of the RHS older members coming up and saying, that's no good, you've got to dig it in. And she had to really fight and hold her ground, because there's still, that in larger organizations, I think it's still a difficulty because you've got traditional views.
Yeah, I can imagine. Excellent. Okay, so we've still got more questions here. Oh yes, for Hannah again. Hilary, this is from Hannah. How many gardeners, I think you mentioned this, does it take to look after the kitchen garden?
At the moment, we've got 2 gardeners. So there's myself and my colleague who also works for 4 days a week. In the past, we did have as many as 5 gardeners during the growing season, so we've had quite a lot cut back. But we do also have quite a large team of volunteers who now come in and help us. So we'll probably have, in the growing season, there might be 2 or 3 volunteers that will be coming in to give us a hand with the weeding and maintenance of the garden. So for an area of 1 acre, it's not that many people, really.
No, exactly.
Yeah, everybody's working very hard to keep on top of it.
Okay. Now, this could be either of you. Is there any, or in fact, some of our panel from this morning, Jerry is asking, is there any historical evidence of application of seaweed, either as a soil improver or to make a liquid fertilizer? So we have Maria and Katerina and Marit here as well, and Karin. Anybody know anything about using seaweed? Maria.
I have seen it mentioned in some books, but I can't right now remember from what time. I think it was from the 19th century, but I'm not sure. And there's also, Sweden has a very long coast. So there are a lot of people living on the coast using it. But I remember my father telling me that my grandmother used to fetch seaweed from the beach in the autumn. Yeah. After the storms, and then they put it onto the rhubarb.
Yes.
They were very great, those rhubarbs.
Heligan uses it a lot because, again, it's near the coast, so that kitchen, I suppose it's, you use whatever is near to you, don't you? Charles, have you ever used seaweed?
Yeah, I love it, and I've seen great results from it. I lived in Western Scotland for a while, used a lot up there. And so the 2 of the vegetables I think that respond best to seaweed that I've seen is asparagus and sea kale, both of which are maritime origin. So I wish I had more.
Makes sense. Yes, of course. Great. But again, the historical evidence isn't necessarily there because it would probably be word of mouth, you know, as you say, your mother telling you or whatever. Okay. Here we go. Toby Beasley. Can no dig be used for bedding displays? It seems very focused on vegetable production, but of course, annual bedding is very similar, isn't it?
Totally the same. God, I would say go for it. And something I've noticed, like bedding displays in dug beds, all the weeds, and you know, you'll get a massive reduction in weeds when you go with no dig because you're not disturbing the soil. For me, weeds are partly a response to soil being damaged, and weeds are a part of the healing mechanism. That's how I see it, and it really explains the experience I've had over my lifetime. So don't disturb the soil, you get just a lot less weeding to do, and I'm sure, well, your blooms will be better. We grow a lot of flowers here. They love it.
Yeah. Okay, so flowers work just as well.
Yeah.
And we've had slugs. Yes, here we go. This is an interesting one. Lena Hirsch, I think this is probably for Charles. How long does it take for the life in soil to re-establish? So if you've got an area of land that has been dug a lot, how long do you think it takes to get that life back?
I would say more than a year, but it's a tricky question, because it depends how much the soil has been damaged and also how you're going about healing it. and the compost on top obviously is going to help. I would say even using, say, biodynamic methods as well. There's a lot of other things you can do to improve soil health, energy, and quality. And within a year, I would say you're going to be close to. You're probably going to be 90%. So you've just got to go for it.
And another Joachim has asked, what's the minimum amount of compost to apply in order to feed the soil if maximizing production is not the goal?
Okay, well, that's interesting. A question like that. Also, there's a few things you're not saying there. It's like, how much do you want to keep the weeds down? I would say in tons per acre, no, tons per hectare, 25 tons a hectare is probably your minimum for having a nice, easy to run garden with not too many weeds and happy growth. Because it's not only about adding nutrients, remember, putting on compost, you're feeding soil life, and that's wildlife. We don't want to deprive the life in our soil of food. So that's how we should be thinking of it. And if we're not allowing ground to grow wild, then, and we got some bare soil at times, then we definitely, I would say, need to be applying compost a little bit every year.
Okay, and there's one for Hilary here from Marika. You're using wood chip between the beds. Is this historically authentic? She asks.
Oh, that's a really interesting question. And from what I've read, I can't remember seeing anything in the old gardening texts about the use of wood chip. But now that you have asked, I will go back and read that. I don't think it was used originally when the garden was first created. I think it was more like a trodden earth and gravel paths, which are, as far as I know, that's authentic. As for the use of bark chip, I'm not sure about that.
Maria has a view on this, I think.
Yes, it is really a source from the mid-17th century. There's described that they used bark, shredded bark, covering between the beds.
Wow, there you go.
It's interesting.
Wood wouldn't have been chipped because that was a valuable resource, but the bark that was was left over, so that could be used.
Great.
And that is a very early source.
Right. So, and then we actually have a couple of questions still from this morning for Katerina, as she's here. I think we've got time just for a couple of those. You said in your talk this morning that the commercial bagged compost gave better results. Do you think the result would have been the same if you'd grown perennials? Because you were just growing annual seedlings, weren't you? And had them in different soil mixtures for several years. Is that